Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to do an extended and very delayed wrap-up. So due to situations going on in the world, I have not been filming a lot lately. It's had me emotionally down, but I am here, I am filming, and I am ready. It does mean that I didn't film a March wrap-up. So today I'm going to be talking about books that I read in March and in April. Plus, I have 3 books that I read in January that I couldn't tell you about until now. So in case you don't know, I was part of the YouTube original BookTube, where I sat down with Jacqueline Woodson, as well as Eileen and Denise and Ebony from the YouTube channel Team 2 Moms, and in January I read 3 of Jacqueline's books back-to-back in one weekend, and I couldn't tell you about it until the episode went live, so that, you wouldn't be spoiled. So I have 3 Jacqueline Woodson books to talk about, as well as all of the books that I read in March. I'm pretty sure I read 6 books in March, I read 3 books in April, and then I have 3 books from January. So, other stuff that I constantly forget to cover, but I'm going to cover now. I have made a challenge for myself to pick at least 1 book out of my TBR jar every single month. My TBR jar, these are the titles of all of the books that I owned prior to the beginning of 2020. My plan was to pick one of these out every single month and read it. I did that for 1 month. I read my March book, it was Wonders of the Invisible World. You'll hear about that. I did not pick out a book for April because I barely read anything in April, and we're just going to celebrate what I did read. I also read a short story collection every single month. Again, I read my short story collection for March. I did not read my short story collection for April. It's fine. And the last thing to tell you about is that every single month my patrons choose a book for me to read. So they picked a March book and an April book. I read both of those books, and you will definitely be hearing about them. They were my 2 favorite books that I read over this whole extended period that I'm covering. So with that out of the way, we are going to start with my lowest rated book that I read, work up to my highest rated book. These aren't being separated up by month, I'm just separating them by rating, and we're gonna go through them that way. So let's start with my least favorite book that I read from this stack of books. So my lowest rated book from all of these months is unfortunately Witches of Ash and Ruin by E. Latimer. If you want to see me cover this book and a few other March 3rd releases more in depth, I did a reading vlog where I read as many March 3rd releases as I could in 24 hours. I wound up reading 4 total books, so I will link that up on the screen and down in the description below if you want to go watch it for more detailed reviews. Witches of Ash and Ruin is set in a small town in Ireland, and it follows a main character who was recently outed as bisexual in her small town. She also is dealing with somatic OCD, and basically all she wants is to ascend to become a full witch, and then a witch in her town turns up dead, and a totally different coven shows up to try to solve the mystery, and there is some clashing between these 2 covens, all while they're trying to solve this murder. This book has so many points of view, it is absurd. Based on what I just told you, it would seem like Dana, our main character, is going to be the only one narrating. That is not remotely the case. Every person gets a point of view, and it's overwhelming and too much. Anytime there's supposed to be a twist, it doesn't really work because guaranteed we've been from the perspective of someone involved in that twist prior to that moment. So this book would have these shocking reveals that were supposed to seem shocking, but we already knew about them because we'd been reading from the villain's point of view, or just even a different character who was on the same side as the main character. If there was anything that our main character didn't know, we had to have a point of view from a character who did know that, so we would know it. It's just really unfortunate the way it was laid out, the way it was written. Besides all of that, I don't think it was written particularly well. I felt absolutely no connection to our main character, Dana, probably because we were in so many different people's heads. And I don't know how I feel about the OCD rep. I don't personally have OCD, but a number of people in my life do have OCD. And so it was something I was really paying attention to, and it didn't feel like it was that ingrained in the book for something that is on the back of the book. I thought that was going to be a bigger part of the representation, and it seems like the author only brought it up in certain scenes and then forgot that that was a character element for a bunch of other scenes. Unfortunately, I gave this book 2 stars out of 5. I did not enjoy reading it at all. It was a slog to get through. Really disappointing because it was one of my most hyped releases of the year, but this just wasn't it. Next up, we have another March 3rd release, and that is This Town Sleeps by Dennis E. Staples, so I also cover this in that March 3rd vlog. This is about an Ojibwa man named Marion who lives on a reservation in Minnesota. He is gay, and he has been meeting up with guys, hooking up with them, And one night he hooks up with this guy, and it's actually someone he knew from high school, a guy named Shannon, who is white and not out of the closet. So this is supposed to be about Shannon navigating this interracial relationship, navigating a relationship with a man who is not remotely prepared to be out. And then there's also some other stuff in here about a death in the community's past, and how that's still affecting Marion and the people in his life. Much like Witches of Ash and Ruin, I felt this had too many perspectives. It's like a 200-page book. It is not long at all, and the first half we're pretty much only following Marion, but in the second half, all of a sudden, we have all of these new perspectives. It's very out of left field, and it really detracts from the story that we were getting in the first half. I was really engaged with the story of Marion and Shannon, and what Marion's life looked like, and the people that he knew, and the way that it just sort of went completely off track and started talking about this murder that happened in the community's past was ultimately relevant, but it felt distracting. It felt like the book constantly forgot that Marion was supposed to be the main character, which I think is deeply unfortunate because he was a really engaging main character. Ultimately, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It had a lot going for it, but I also felt like it completely lost its way about halfway through, and while I was prepared to completely love this, it just lost me. The one short story collection that I have for these months is I Know You Know Who I Am by Peter Kispert. I'm sad that this book is sitting here. It was another one of my most hyped releases of the year. This is a short story collection. Every single story follows a queer main character. There is one story that is narrated by a queer woman. The rest are all queer dudes. And every story supposedly deals with the consequence of a lie or a secret. Now, again, this might seem shocking to you, because this is a pretty short book. It is like 200 pages and change, 220 pages, and it has 21 stories, which is way too many for a collection this length. And it's because about half of the stories in this collection are what would be called flash fiction, which means that they are set over 2 pages or less. And I think that those stories severely detracted from the overall impact of this collection. I think flash fiction has a place, and some of them were somewhat interesting, but so many of them did the exact same thing. It was so frustrating to have stories that I liked mixed in with these little 1.5-page stories that were all the exact same. That were all about white lies that you tell in gay dating life. There were a couple of stories I really loved of this collection. Oddly enough, it was the 2 speculative stories that I think were the most engaging. There was a very dystopian Black Mirror type story at the end of the first section that I loved, and I wanted so much for the rest of the collection to emulate the writing and the world building of that. But after the first, 3 stories, all of the rest of them just felt repetitive. They were the same thing over and over and over again. Ultimately, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I have a full review where I review every single story down in the description below. I think my average rating was something like 3.8, but looking back on it, I think I was going way too easy on some of the longer stories because at least it was a break from the flash fiction. Okay, I promise we're getting to the end of our 3-star reviews. The last 3-star book I want to talk about is Rick by Alex Gino. This is a middle grade book. It is the companion to the middle grade book George, which is about a young trans girl coming to terms with her identity, trying to come out. This is set a couple of years after George. It follows a main character named Rick, and he is really struggling with his best friend. He's not sure how he fits into his best friend's life anymore, and he's also struggling with the fact that it seems like everyone else his age wants to kiss, wants to be in a relationship, and Rick has absolutely no interest in that. And he winds up joining a Rainbow Spectrum Club where he can start to learn about himself. And ultimately, this is a book about a character who is questioning if maybe he might be on the ace spectrum. This also features the characters from George and a number of other characters, and I think as a middle grade tool teaching about queer identity, it's super valuable. This is something that I would love to see in a lot of middle school classrooms, in middle school libraries. I think it's going to do some amazing work for queer middle graders. It was cool enough to have an ace main character in middle grade, but this Rainbow Spectrum Club really openly discusses so many different issues and identities and is so accepting and loving. So I really loved all of that. I just think that some of the stuff with Rick's best friend was a little weak. It just sort of felt like it was there to have another plot line, but it wasn't super fleshed out. It didn't make a ton of sense. I was way more engaged with Rick's story with his grandfather. I loved that story. His grandfather, he doesn't do drag, he cross-dresses. He likes to cosplay as women, and that is something that Rick is kind of the first person in his grandpa's family to learn about that, and something that they can kind of bond over. And I loved that storyline, and I just felt like I would have loved so much more of that and so much less of Rick and his best friend. So I think that this is going to be valuable. I think it's going to be educational and useful, but it wasn't for me. I think personally George was a much better book. It was way more balanced and interesting. This has value, just not as much value for me. So I personally gave it 3 out of 5 stars, but if you are looking for queer books for middle graders, whether it's for your own middle graders or to put in a classroom or library, I definitely recommend this as part of that collection. Okay, let's talk about another March 3rd release, and that is Post-Colonial Love Poem by Natalie Diaz. This is a book of poetry. It is about the body. It is about the native body and the space that Indigenous people occupy in our country, in the world. It's also about the queer body and what that means and how a queer body occupies space. I talked about this in my March 3rd vlog. It was a gorgeous collection that went very over my head, so I loved so much of it. I got so much out of it. But I also feel like I'm going to get more out of this the more that I read it, the more that I dissect all of the words and the concepts that are at play in this collection. I am not someone who has read a lot of poetry, so it's okay that I didn't fully understand this collection. It is not a part of my brain that has worked really hard in the past, but it's something that I'm invested in unlocking as I go forward in my reading. If you are a fan of poetry, if you read a lot of poetry, I think that you're going to love this collection. It is a brilliant piece of poetry as a whole. Some of Natalie's long-form poems are just gorgeous. I'm really glad that I had the chance to read this. I think that I'm so, weird about giving this review because I did love it, but there was so much I didn't understand, and it's weird for me to occupy that space, and it's weird for me to acknowledge that this is something I'm gonna have to work on to continue to unlock. My brain always struggles with that concept, but I'm glad that I have the chance to really work on something, to really work on reading and understanding something. I'm looking forward to, pursuing that in the future. So ultimately I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I think it's brilliant. If you love poetry, please pick it up. Next, let's talk about one of my Jacqueline Woodson books, and that is Red at the Bone. Yay! So it got signed. So cool. This is a multi-generational family story. It starts in 2001 at a girl named Melody's coming-of-age ceremony. She is putting on this dress, and then we move backwards and forwards in time as we unlock the story of Melody's parents, of their parents before them. It's very much bookended by tragedy, but it is also about the sacrifices of parenthood and about how parenthood shapes a life. Early on, one of the themes is that Melody is putting on this dress, and that dress was supposed to be her mother's. It was supposed to be a dress her mother wore at her own coming-of-age ceremony, but she didn't get the chance to because she became a teen mom. Iris, Melody's mom, is also queer, and there's some storyline following that. I love multi-generational stories. I love the ideas presented here. There was some narrative stuff that I didn't quite get. The moving backwards and forwards in time left me sometimes confused about who exactly we were following, which story we were covering. So I think that that is also something that, upon a reread, I'll be able to get through more, just because we move so rapidly through each of these different family members that I would get a little confused by the family tree, but that's possibly more on me than the book itself. I thought that this was really excellent. I gave a 4 out of 5 stars. It's not my favorite Jacqueline Woodson book that I've read, but it's also not my least favorite. I think that it is a brilliant work of fiction, so. Another Jacqueline Woodson book I have is actually a reread, and that is Brown Girl Dreaming. I read this when I was in college because Jacqueline came to my university. I met her. She was friends with the head of the Women's and Gender Studies department at the university I went to. So this was actually also signed just a few years ago. Yay! We love signed books. This is Jacqueline's memoir in verse. It is covering her life. She was born in Ohio, but moved to Alabama when she was quite young, and it is about growing up in the South with her grandparents, and then making the move to Brooklyn in New York City, and how that completely changed her life. What it was like to be a young black girl growing up in New York City when all she'd ever known was the South. I loved this when I read it when I was in college. I loved this now. A memoir in verse is something that I am familiar with. It was something that my mom would read to me when I was younger, so reading a story like this always feels a bit like coming home to me. It always feels just natural to be consuming this story. This was my introduction to Jacqueline. This is the first book I ever read by her, and so it's always going to have an extremely special place in my heart. This is aimed at middle grade readers and young adult readers, so maybe that will help you decide if it's something you want to read. It's not overly complex, it's very easy to follow, but it's beautifully written. I really recommend it. I gave it 4 stars when I read it originally. I give it 4 stars now, or when I reread it in January. Fantastic. Next up, we have the TBR jar book that I grabbed in March, and that is Wonders of the Invisible World by Christopher Barzak. I bought this last year, I think, at a library book sale because I'd heard about it as a queer release, and I'm so glad that I finally read it. I don't know when I would have if I hadn't grabbed it out of the TBR jar, and there's so much I didn't know about this book, and I'm really glad that I finally read it. This is about a teenage boy named Aiden who is living in this small town in Ohio. He's just kind of drifting through life. He doesn't really have connections. He doesn't have friends. And then this boy shows up. This boy, Jared, who says that he used to be Aiden's best friend. And the more time that Aiden spends with Jared, the more he remembers about his childhood. It seems like he forgot everything about his life, that he became a new person, and Jared arriving kind of unlocks his past, unlocks the secrets that Aiden's mom has been keeping from him, unlocks a possible curse that is plaguing their family. I am going to heartily recommend this if you love the Raven Cycle and you would like more books like the Raven Cycle. Aiden is gay, and there is a male-male romance that is happening in this book, but beyond that, and like how many similarities Aiden and Jared have to Adam and Ronan, the lyrical writing, the small town setting, it's all very similar to the Raven Cycle, as is the way magic is written. This is definitely a character-driven book over a plot-driven book. There are going to be a lot of moments where people who struggle with character-driven books find it boring. I know that that was like a common review on Goodreads. A lot of people found this boring, and I can see that, and it's because of how character-driven it is. Not that much happens. We are just following Aiden unlocking his own past. So if you're not into deeply character-driven books, then maybe this won't be for you, but I think it is an excellent comp to the Raven Cycle. It was magical, it was inventive. I desperately want to read more by Christopher Barzak. I am so glad that I got the chance to read this. Thank goodness for my TBR jar. I feel like I won. I finally won with the TBR jar. Ultimately, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. It's fabulous. The last March 3rd release that I have is The Fire Never Goes Out by Noelle Stevenson. This is a memoir in pictures. If you don't know who Noelle Stevenson is, please join me. Please learn. Noelle Stevenson is one of the original creators of the Lumberjanes comics. She is also the writer of Nimona and is the showrunner for the Netflix original series She-Ra. I love Noelle, and I have loved her since I was in high school when she was just ginger hazing on Tumblr, and she would do Gimli Legolas comics. I've followed her for so long. This is a memoir. It is a memoir told through comics collected throughout Noelle's life, as well as wrap-ups at the end of every year that Noelle would do on her Tumblr. As I said in my vlog, my only issue with this is that I'd pretty much seen all of the work in this collection before because I have been following Noelle for so long. I recognized, most of the comics. I have read her end-of-year wrap-ups for every year that she's done them. But I think it's so valuable to go back and see where Noelle's art started, to see her evolution as an artist, to see her evolution in terms of coming out, in terms of meeting her wife, marrying her wife, in terms of her struggle with mental health. There is so much that Noelle covers that really has always struck a chord with me, and so to see everything all in one collection, was beautiful. It made me cry. Noelle's work always makes me cry. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. If you love Noelle, definitely pick this up. If you're new to Noelle, then maybe read some of her work, and then jump into this. I also wanted to mention a poetry collection that I read, and that is Soft in the Middle by Shelby Eileen. At the time that I downloaded this poetry collection, all of Shelby's work was free to download on Amazon. I'm not sure if that's changed. If all of their work is still for free to download, I will leave links in the description. Soft in the Middle is a poetry collection about being queer and about being fat. It is about Shelby's journey loving their own body, of accepting the different types of people that they could fall for, accepting the way their body could look, and the different ways that they can explore gender. I've really wanted to read one of their other collections that is an Arrow Ace, like, Artemis-inspired poetry collection, which I downloaded as well. I'm so glad that I started with Soft in the Middle. It gave me a good queer feels cry. Loved reading this. I'm so glad that I jumped on the chance to download the rest of Shelby's work. I will absolutely be working through the rest of the poetry collections that I have from them. This was so good. Please read it. If I look like I'm sweating, it's because I am. It is so hot. The last Jacqueline Woodson book that I want to talk about is my favorite Jacqueline Woodson book I've ever read, and that is Another Brooklyn. This is such a good book. This starts in the 1970s in Brooklyn, and it follows a girl as she meets a group of friends who become deeply important to her at this developmental age in their preteens. There's something that I find so engaging about this concept of preteen girls connecting and becoming like one creature while they're in this essential developmental period between childhood and adulthood, and that shift that they take on together. I find it so fascinating. It is something I love to read about, and it is perfectly encapsulated in this book. The way that Jacqueline writes about friendship, about that incredibly fierce, protective friendship that sometimes happens between girls, is just deeply valuable to me, and this is a sad book. It's a heartbreaking book, but it captures the rawness of that moment for me, and that's what I love about it. Like, I have such a hard time describing this book because there isn't a plot line that's easy to follow from beginning to end. It is about this moment captured, about these 4 girls becoming best friends at this exact moment. So I'm having a hard time describing it. If you are into the books that I like, I think that you will enjoy this. The main character is queer. It's mentioned somewhat later on, but it is a part of this book. Jacqueline has been doing work in queer fiction for ages. It's remarkable. So this and Red at the Bone I don't think are talked about as much as queer releases, but they are. They are queer books. I loved reading this. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was remarkable that I didn't highlight the entire book. The writing is just ridiculously good. The last 2 books that I'm going to talk about are both of my patron chosen books, and I don't want you to think that every single time I read a patron chosen book, it's one of my favorite books of the month. I just need you to know that in March and April, my patrons picked the perfect books for me to read. I think it was an issue where you all could tell that I was struggling a little bit, and I am so glad that I had these books that made me love reading, and I've been having a harder time with that this year. So in March, my patrons chose for me to read An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, and in April they chose for me to read The Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James by Ashley Herring Blake. So we're gonna talk about The Mighty Heart of Sunny St. James first, and then we'll talk about this. This is a middle grade book following Sunny St. James, who has recently had a heart transplant, and she makes this list of the stuff that she wants to do once she has a new heart. The first thing is that she wants to do things that she never would have been able to do prior to her transplant. The second is to get a new best friend because something happened with her last best friend. And the third is to kiss a boy. And this is a list that she's working on accomplishing, but some things are thrown her way that are unexpected, such as the fact that her mother suddenly reappears in her life when she has not been a part of Sunny's life for years and years. The other is the fact that she meets a girl who she finds really engaging and wonderful, and Sunny is trying to shove down the fact that at one point she thought about kissing girls as well as boys. It didn't go well for her, so she's really pushing that part of herself down. I sobbed reading this book. I always sob reading Ashley Herring Blake's books. I read Ivy Aberdeen's Letter to the World last year, became one of my new favorite books ever. I'm obsessed with it. I sobbed through How to Make a Wish. I haven't read her other books yet. I know, I'm working on it. But this was so good. It deals with complex family structures, which is a thing that Ashley Herring Blake gets, and I love it. It deals with queer issues spectacularly well. It is about this fierce, funny girl who has this second chance at life, and the confusing way that she handles that is so good. I hope that Ashley Herring Blake just keeps writing queer middle grade, and queer YA for that matter, for the rest of my life. I want to keep reading it forever. This book's made me so emotional. I can't even talk about it anymore. I gave it 5 stars. It's brilliant. And the last book that I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, which it was my favorite thing, so I think you can guess what rating I gave it. This is about a girl named April May. She is, I think, 22 years old. 23 years old. She has this bachelor's in design. She's dealing with a ton of loans from art school, and one night while she is walking home from her job, she discovers this sculpture. And she calls her friend, they film a YouTube video, they decide to call the sculpture Carl, and it turns out that Carl is a much bigger deal than just a random sculpture appearing in New York City. It turns out that Carl's appeared all over the world at the exact same time, and April was the first person to ever film it, and the first person to name it. So this rockets her into popularity. She is becoming more and more at the center of this story and what the Carls mean, and then there are numerous other investigations to be done. April is a bisexual girl, and she starts the book in a relationship with another girl, but her bisexuality is very important overall to the story. This captured what it's like to be a 20-something, just trying to get through the day. It's funny, it's inventive, it uses references appropriately. There were so many moments in this book where I was remembering reading Ready Player One and absolutely fucking hating Ready Player One because of the way it made references. Like, when I read that book, it felt like Ernest Cline was trying to let everyone know he was better than all of you because he knows references. It felt condescending and bogged down, and this was like how to do references correctly as a way to uplift and as a way that is current with the way that at least I experience media. This also really captured what it means to be on the internet and what it means to have any kind of following on the internet. Obviously, I'm nowhere near Hank or April, but Hank, because of his position as someone who has been on the internet and especially YouTube for so long, understands what it means to be online and in the public eye in a particular way, and I love the way that he writes about that. I loved this book. I couldn't put it down. Like, I have had such a hard time reading ever since shelter in place, social distancing. I have had the most difficult time sitting down and focusing on reading, and I sat down and I read this book. I just sat down and I read the whole thing, and that hasn't happened to me in so long. It's been so long since I've read a book where the world disappeared, and when I finished reading it, I was like, where the fuck am I? I can't wait to read the sequel to this. I am so glad that my patrons chose this as my March book. I'm obsessed with it. I thought it was just so damn good. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Okay, y'all, that is it. Those are all of the books that I read in March, April, and a couple from January. Please let me know what your favorite book that you read was last month. Let's just go with April. What was your favorite book that you read in April? Plus, if you've read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts about them down in the comments below. I would love to chat more about any of these titles. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I so appreciate and love all of you, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!